Gresham College presents Whatever Turns You On by Professor Glenn D. Wilson.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. I'm Glenn Wilson, and the topic is this one. That's a scene from an American cartoon series called Family Guy, but a very ordinary American family, as you can see. Now, more sex takes place in our head than in our bed. The sex therapist, American sex therapist Helen Kaplan, once famously said that sex equals friction plus fantasy. So sort of the E equals MC squared of sex research. But the point she's making is that both physical and mental stimulation are necessary for optimum arousal and excitement. And the first of them is fairly standard, what constitutes the optimum friction. But the mental component is highly variable from one person to another. And it is based on hopes, memories, and it is pooled and refined across the course of development so that people tend to build in their head little scripts and scenarios that are idiosyncratic to themselves. I hope I'm not giving away anything about myself by that image that I've selected on the right there. It's just that she's a compatriot of mine. Lucy Lawless. Now, fantasies are interesting because they tap the very instinctive basis of our sexual drive. They are unconstrained by social taboos of one sort or another and by the reservations of our partner, the things that they are prepared to do or not. So they're also tailor-made to our precise requirement. People wear the sort of clothes that we want them to wear or not, as the case may be. So they are perfectly devised to turn us on, and as a result, fantasies will often exceed reality in terms of excitement value. And that is one of the reasons why a scientific study of fantasies is of importance to bring us closer to the evolutionary origins of our sexual drive. Now, one of the first steps in a scientific analysis of any topic, of course, is measurement. And the most obvious way to get at sexual fantasies is by questionnaire, self-report questionnaire. Actually, you ask people what they fantasize about. You may have to do this anonymously because people might have misgivings about telling it all to a researcher on their doorstep. But the sex fantasy questionnaire that I devised some decades ago was based on culling little fantasies from various sources, my friends, women's magazines, previous scientific research, wherever I could find fantasies. Forum magazine was a fine source. I got together a whole lot of popular themes that varied from rather orthodox to slightly kinky, listed them all down the left and asked people to respond with a frequency that was specific to themselves, ranging from never, which was scored 0, to regularly, which scored 5. There were intermediate descriptors between those two were, never 0, seldom 1, occasionally scored 2, sometimes 3, often 4, and regularly 5 was the scale we were operating on. And people had to rate each theme on the same scale according to whether it was a daytime fantasy, fantasies that they had during intercourse and masturbation, dreams while asleep, things they have done in reality, and things that they would like to do in reality. So we have sneaked in there an actual measure of what they do as well as what they think about and what they would like to do. In fact, there are quite strong correlations amongst all 5 of those, although the dreams while asleep is very much lower in terms of the absolute numbers.
Using a technique of factor analysis, which is a mathematical classification procedure, I was able to find that there were 4 main groupings of people's sexual fantasy, which I called exploratory, including things like orgies, mate swapping, promiscuity. The intimate fantasies, things like kissing passionately, making love outdoors in a field of flowers, intercourse with a loved partner, were intimate fantasies. Impersonal means that there was no other person, just things like objects, like being turned on by fur or leather or objects with which one might stimulate oneself. And a few other strange things like watching other people have sex and being turned on by urination. Those were the impersonal fantasies. There were 10 in each of these groups, incidentally. And the 4th category was sadomasochistic. The interesting thing here was that being whipped or spanked tended to go along with whipping and spanking. In other words, one might have expected separate factors for sadism and masochism, but in fact the two tend to go together in this procedure. So those were the 4 categories that we arrived at, and here are some typical distribution of scores for average men and women in the British population, representative men and women. You can see there that men are declaring more fantasies in all 4 groups. Intimate fantasies were the most commonly reported, followed by exploratory, impersonal, and sadomasochistic fantasies had the lowest frequency. But interestingly, it was the exploratory and impersonal that showed the greatest difference between men and women, with men being particularly high in those two relative to women. Women approximated to male levels more in the intimate and the sadomasochistic categories. Now, men overall are declaring about twice the amount of fantasy as women, as you will have gathered from that graph. And the reason seems to, you might think it's women are reluctant to declare fantasies, but in fact they were twice as willing to return the questionnaire, so it's not a very likely explanation. It is perhaps true that some of the fantasies of women are so esoteric, so romantic, that they might not even have been recognized or classified by the individual themselves as sexual. That is a possibility. But the real reason for the preponderance of sexual fantasies in men is this nasty little hormone, testosterone, in which women do have some of, but men have a great deal more of it. And there is abundant evidence that the amount of the total fantasy output produced by a person is dependent upon testosterone. For example, serum testosterone levels will predict the frequency of fantasies in adolescent boys, whereas 6 other hormones did not in this particular research study. Something similar was found with teenage girls. Even though their levels of testosterone are very much lower than the boys, the variation within the girls showed that those with higher levels of testosterone were producing the most sexual fantasies. We know that giving testosterone supplements to perhaps menopausal women will increase their libido and their fantasies, as though the two are indistinguishable. And anti-testosterone therapy is widely used for sex criminals and people who would like to damp their sex drive. The interesting thing about testosterone is that it will magnify and drive whatever sexual inclination you have. It doesn't tell whether you're, say, gay or straight, or whether you like high-heeled shoes or large numbers of young women, but it will, your testosterone will power whatever direction your sex drive wants to take. Now, men and women differ in ways that fit nicely with evolutionary predictions. That is, in line with the parental investment theory, men tend to fantasize about large numbers of anonymous young female partners, whereas women tend to prefer thinking about sex with identified people, sometimes their actual partner or husband, or sometimes a famous individual, but the object of their fantasy is normally known to them. Men's fantasies tend to feature anatomical details. They tend to be pornographic, whereas women focus more on the emotional and romantic context of the fantasy. And as I say, those differences fit rather nicely with expectations derived from evolutionary theory. In this slide is a typical male and a typical female fantasy. I don't imagine you'll have a lot of trouble guessing which is which. Now, because a lot of items in the sex fantasy questionnaire were paired as sort of actor and recipient, active-passive forms, like whipping or being whipped, giving oral sex, receiving oral sex, that enabled us to calculate separate totals for active versus passive fantasies. And what we found, you can see in that graph, is that men and women don't differ a great deal with respect to passive fantasies. Actually, even with passive fantasies, men tend to declare more than women. But there is a very big difference in active fantasies, with men declaring about twice the frequency of active fantasies. So if you just take a ratio of active to passive, men are more active than passive, but the difference is really down to the difference in the frequency of the active fantasies, not the passive ones. We repeated the study in Japan, as a matter of fact, and found exactly the same thing. That is, the same male-female differences appear in Japan, although the overall totals of sexual fantasy tended to be much lower. And there are various ways you could explain that, either in terms of the characteristics of the individuals. Testosterone levels tend to be lower within Far Eastern peoples, or it could be a social thing, although I doubt that Japan is such an inhibited society that would sufficiently account for the difference. But exactly the same pattern of male-female differences does appear in Japan. Now, it seems that fantasies occupy slightly different roles within the lives of men and women. Sigmund Freud, way back in 1908, reckoned that fantasies were due to dissatisfaction. It was a sort of a deficient reality theory, that you would only fantasize if there was something wrong with reality. Now, we now know that that is probably not true, but there's a little bit more truth in it with respect to women than men. And in this graph, which you may not be able to read the actual items, it's a bit fuzzy, I admit, we have fantasies placed in relation to two orthogonal dimensions. One is libido, or sex drive. It's going up and down on the page, and the other is dissatisfied to satisfied from left to right. Now, the first thing you'll observe is that nearly all of the fantasies from the sex fantasy questionnaire go with libido. That is, high levels of sex drive raise the level with which that fantasy is occurring. But on the dissatisfaction-satisfaction dimension, there is a difference between men and women, such that men tend to be fantasizing most when they are dissatisfied with their sex life, perhaps deprived, as in prison or public school. And Whereas the women are tending to fantasize more when they are satisfied with their sex life, which would tend to support the idea that, that fantasies are perhaps awakened by an active sex life in women, a bit like Brunhilde. A sexual awakening seems to be involved here. When things are going well in the sex life of a woman, she will be having more fantasies. With men, it tends to be the other way about. Notice that the correlation with libido is greater in women than men. Women, incidentally, are at the top right. Where's my little pointer thingamy? Yeah, those are the women, those are the men. Don't worry too much about the particular items that are involved, but they are individual items within the sex fantasy questionnaire. You notice that the correlations between libido and the fantasy are higher for women, and that's probably because women are more variable in testosterone than men. Hence, they tend to be clustered a bit over here. Do people share their fantasies with their partner? Well, apparently only a minority do. 26% of men said that they do, and 32% of women. It almost certainly depends on the content of the fantasy and whether the partner makes an appearance in the fantasy or someone else. Now, there was a study showing that the majority of people claimed that they would not feel jealous if their partner admitted fantasizing and thinking about another person in their fantasy, and that was particularly true for women. A quotation from the Duke of Wellington comes to mind. He was apparently walking down the Mall one day, and a chap approached him and said, "Mr. Jones, I believe." To which he replied, "If you believe that, you believe anything." And that is probably the case about whether your partner is going to be jealous if you tell them that you're fantasizing about the next door neighbor. Now, one of the limitations of my sex fantasy questionnaire is that it actually suggests all the themes that people might have been fantasizing about. But there is another way of exploring this, which is to ask people to write out in narrative form a favorite fantasy, perhaps the number one favorite fantasy. And you then do a content analysis to pick out the themes that are coming up most often. And here are some of them that I've picked out for this purpose. You can see that group sex appears in close to a third of the fantasies written out by men in free form, and only about half that often in women. Again, men's fantasies much more likely to be voyeuristic or fetishistic, visual in style. You know, she had, I don't know, ginger pubic hair or something like that would be a detail that would make it voyeuristic. Here's one that's a bit more popular with women, allowing the steady partner to be incorporated within the fantasy. Almost twice as many women that would apply to as men. And romantic settings, again, come out more often amongst women. Here's one that's perhaps a little surprising, that a higher proportion of women fantasize about rape or force than men, in fact, considerably more. And that is a rather interesting thing. It appears that rape force is one of the most popular female fantasies. It's in that last study, it was top-ranked by about 13% of women, and it is reported as at least occurring sometimes in amongst about 50% of the female population. Now, does that mean that women subconsciously want to be raped? I doubt that very much. I think more likely they like the idea of being irresistible to a man. But there's a catch-22. They want that man to be somebody that they would like to be raped by, not your average rapist in the park who offers a knife. So they probably got somebody in mind more like Rudolph Valentino's Sheik or Christopher Lee's Dracula. Perhaps we had a image of before, or indeed Johnny Depp as a pirate. Some researchers have looked at the relationship between childhood sexual abuse and the occurrence of force fantasies, and have found a positive correlation. But the effect almost certainly depends upon whether the sexual abuse in childhood was experienced as arousing or distressing at the time. If any of you have seen the film A Dangerous Method, there's a still from it there on the slide. Keira Knightley plays the part of Sabina Spielstein or something, I think her name was. She was a Russian girl who had been sexually abused by her father in childhood, but claimed to have actually been excited by it, and hence wanted to repeat the experience. And Carl Jung, played by Michael Fassbender, obliges at some point down the line, which is what we see in this picture, or don't see, because there is a bedpost or something conveniently placed to prevent it becoming too explicit. Overall, force fantasies in women seem to be associated with higher sexual satisfaction, and hence we couldn't say that they were necessarily a pathological form, though they may indeed connect in some way with childhood experiences. Now, you would imagine that men who like to be whipped, spanked, and humiliated by women would be a rather rare breed, but in fact, submission fantasies are very common amongst men, and perhaps especially among those who occupy powerful positions in daily life. Very respectable people like judges and headmasters are often found doing this, and it's been suggested that because their day-to-day life is so regimented, they enjoy, and they're required to make decisions all the time, they enjoy a certain holiday in being told what to do by a dominatrix. I sometimes wonder, in fact, if it is just selective reporting in the press. The tabloids obviously are more interested if a famous, powerful male is caught being humiliated like Max Mosley or Jonathan Aitken, and would ignore the frequency with which the average Joe might be caught with these preferences. And indeed, it might just be a correlation with powerful men having high sex drives of whatever direction their sex drive goes. That is the phenomenon that is really being observed rather than any specific interest in masochism. But that said, it is interesting to speculate as to where male masochism might arise from, what would be the cause of it. And there are a number of possibilities. One that comes up quite often is the idea that at the time of early childhood sexual imprinting, a little boy's mother is the primary disciplinarian in the family. Father is maybe off at work, and she is saying, "You're a naughty boy, I'm going to smack your bottom." And that this somehow gets taken into the blueprint for sexual arousal at that very impressionable young age. And the fact that sexual preferences have infantile origins is supported by the fact that quite a number of men have dummy fetishes or want to be dressed in nappies as well as be spanked. So there are things that would suggest a very early childhood origin. Shoe fetishes are very much more common than hat fetishes. And I've wondered about that and think the possible reason is that the mother's shoe, high-heeled shoe, is much more salient in the sight line of a crawling infant than the hat, which would be very remote. And she wouldn't be wearing one in the house anyway. But that is an interesting fact, again, which would suggest an infantile origin of certain male kinky tendencies, fetishistic and sadomasochistic. There are other possibilities. For example, there is a certain overlap in arousal of all sources, so that fear and aggression and sexual desire all involve a certain amount of adrenaline and therefore are easily confused one with another. So one form of emotional arousal can amplify others, and hence the fear of being spanked might be misattributed as sexual excitement. There's even the idea that being spanked on the backside redistributes the blood supply to the genitals, hence gives you a head start in the arousal process. That would apply to women as much as men. So there are lots of possibilities there. One thing is quite certain, that most men indulge such urges not so much at home, but by visiting a specialist prostitute. And they do not want to be cured of these predilections. They enjoy them far too much. Now, we did some studies with paraphilic groups. These were men who are not in trouble with the law. They've not done anything illegal, but they were members of kinky clubs like the Rubber Fetishist Society and the, I think they called themselves Cooperative Motivation Society or something. They were sadomasochists. So we got groups of men, some normal and some variant, to complete the sex fantasy questionnaire. And these are the scores we came up with. You notice that the sadomasochists are highest on all four categories, though they exceed the other two groups, particularly on their own favoured category, sadomasochism. Impersonal, you would think, is closest to fetishistic interests, and indeed the fetishists came up relatively high on impersonal, certainly compared with normals, but the sadomasochists were even higher on that. The nearest the normal men came to competing with the two variant groups were on the intimate fantasies and to some degree on exploratory. This enabled us to derive what we called a variance quotient. That is, because impersonal and sadomasochistic categories are relatively kinky and intimate and exploratory are relatively normal, we developed what we called a variance quotient, which was summing the impersonal and the sadomasochistic fantasies and dividing or expressing it as a ratio of the impersonal sadomasochistic as a ratio of intimate plus exploratory. And that we call the variance quotient, and it's been used in quite a bit of research. In our own research, we were using it to locate the brain regions that mediate sexual excitement in normal and paraphilic men, using EEG. We found that something called the P600 component, which is a positive voltage change in the brain occurring 0.6 of a second after the appearance of the stimulus, which was an erotic picture ranging from normal to kinky. We found that that was the component that best divided paraphilic from normal men. And we further went on to show that most normal men showed their peak of response in the right parietal area, which is the visual pattern part of the brain, whereas the high VQ people, the fetishists and sadomasochists, tended to be responding more in the left frontal area of the brain, which is where social and verbal scripts might be contained. The variance quotient has been used by other people to look at the neurodevelopmental correlates of paraphilia. And my colleague Kazi Rahman found that paraphilic men had a greater number of older brothers had feminized finger ratios, that's the second to fourth finger ratio, and a tendency to left-handedness, which made them more comparable to gay men than than heterosexual men. So one possible conclusion is that both of those groups were subjected to lower prenatal testosterone levels, is the sort of explanation that Raman and his group were working on. Now, all of that, incidentally, is concerning men who are not dangerous, just have unusual sexual preferences. But we now go on to the question of when fantasies might become dangerous. Now, one thing we've already established is that paraphilic fantasies, the kinky ones, are so common in healthy men that the risk levels must be really low. If every sadomasochistic fantasy was acted out, we'd have a lot more sex criminals roaming about than we do at the moment. So most of them are contained in fantasy, or at worst are played out in cooperative role-playing games with consenting partners. There are such people as criminal sadists, but they're a little bit different. They show escalating patterns of fantasy followed by little behavioral rehearsals of one kind or another, and they pursue unwilling targets right from the kickoff and never waver in that preference. There are other differences. Criminal sadists differ from SM enthusiasts, as we call them, in that they tend to come from the ranks of low-level itinerant occupations like bouncers, barmen, wheel clampers, and amusement park workers, whereas SM enthusiasts come from more creative and professional occupations. The criminal sadists tend to plan their crimes meticulously, directing their attention towards locating, abducting, restraining, and torturing unwilling victims. And they make no attempt to find partners who would cooperate voluntarily in their fantasies. And a third difference, they tend to be cold and brutal, lacking not just empathy, but they lack ceremony, they lack symbolism, and in one researcher's description, they lack theatre in the games that they play. They're just plain cold and brutal. The sex fantasy questionnaire has found application in the risk assessment of sexual offenders. Child molesters tend to be distinguished from non-sexual offenders by high scores on exploratory and intimate scales, rather than the impersonal or sadomasochistic factors. In other words, the offenders seem to show a low variance quotient, but one wonders whether there is an underreporting effect going on here, because they might reasonably be concerned about parole decisions based on the way that they are answering a questionnaire that is put to them, very often in jail. There's a particularly telling study coming out of New Zealand by a team led by Hudson, giving a large battery of psychometric tests to men who are incarcerated for sexual molestation, trying to see which of them would predict recidivism after release. And the sex fantasy questionnaire, impersonal and SM scales emerged as the best predictors, but only for the pre-treatment scores. After treatment, the correlations disappeared. Now, what is going on here? It suggests that any improvement following treatment was illusory, that the more deviant fantasies seem to have been cured, the greater was the risk that the individual would reoffend. Were they deceiving themselves or just the authorities, one might ask? But it's a cautionary finding with the respect to evaluating therapy for sexual offending within the context of a prison. Sometimes the more effective your therapy seems to have been, the more dangerous the individual is when you let him out. You can, of course, back it up with erectile responses taken with a device called a penile plethysmograph to various erotic images. And generally speaking, child sex offenders respond more to child images than to adult images, or at least a third of them do, and another third of them show similar responses to child and adult pornography, whereas normal men never show much of a response to children. So it's a good backup diagnostic system, but it is not totally immune to faking. That is, that some sex offenders learn how to suppress their response to the key images of the children, and hence disguise their sexual interest. It's not easy to distinguish rapists from control men using erectile responses. It seems that only a very small proportion of rapists are actually excited by the resistance of the victim. Most of them would just prefer that she lay down and enjoyed it. They would rather have a consenting woman than one that was fighting. Their problem seems to be more in their inability to recognize or be deterred by the cues of refusal from the woman. Some of them have distorted beliefs. They think that the woman is insincere in her protests. Or they think that if I carry on and persist long enough, she will get around to enjoying it. Others are just total psychopaths and they don't care one way or another. But there are very few of them who actually enjoy the fight that the woman puts up and regard it as part of their ideal excitement scenario. Of course, erectile responses to images that have been supplied by the researchers don't tell us what these offenders are dreaming about in their private lives. And they don't prove that any responses that they give to the images supplied are instrumental in precipitating their crimes. So fantasies are not a necessary or even a sufficient cause of any of these problems: child molestation, rape, exhibitionism, sadistic murder, any of the typical sexual offences. They very often involve fantasy, but that doesn't mean that the fantasy is necessarily the cause of it. Very often their fantasies are recollections of the wonderful things they did before they got caught. And they didn't necessarily precede the offending history. We also know that plenty of men have fantasies of rape and sadism and so on without ever doing anything illegal or ever being in danger of doing anything unacceptable. So almost certainly we have to consider some other factors, and the risk factors that we need to consider seem to be these: that where you have an obsessional, escalating fantasy, one that is dominating the person's thought processes, getting worse from time to time, and especially if it is being interspersed with little in vivo tryouts, then you might start to get worried. If there is a very dysfunctional family history, that tends to be a bad sign. That is, relatives like parents and siblings and so on who are also involved in sex criminal behavior, or even other forms of crimes. Petty crime, burglary, it often goes with more serious crimes like serial killing. There are personality traits, psychopathy most obviously, that you would be concerned about. Most men who have sadistic fantasies who are not psychopaths never get round to acting out those fantasies with unwilling victims. So psychopathy is almost a necessary additional factor. Then there are attitudes that might be considered. Hostility towards women is one of them. Some of the rape myths that I mentioned, that women actually like it, even however much they protest. And then there are feelings of impotence in the general sense of powerlessness. People who feel inadequate in their everyday life. They are perhaps socially isolated. That is another risk factor in terms of sadistic fantasies being translated into illegal activities. When I first got involved in researching sexual fantasies, some of my colleagues were dismissive of the whole idea. They thought that it was either prurient or frivolous. And hence, I thought I would give you a couple of examples of where it is not, where fantasies are important in what is going on amongst criminals, and how a study of fantasies might be helpful in establishing guilt or indeed innocence. There was one case that I was involved in. The West Midlands Police in 2000 acquired transcripts of a couple of paedophiles who were in jail at the time, but they were planning to drive around in a van that they didn't yet have. They were going to acquire a van, drive it around, looking for young girls aged 2 to 10 to abduct, rape, and murder. Now, their defense was that they were just fantasizing about these events. So I was called in to assess whether the conversations that they had the transcripts of were mere fantasy or planning for action. And my conclusion was that they were intending actual abductions. There were several strands of evidence, but one of the clearest, I think, was the lack of airbrushing in the details. Fantasy tends to dwell on positive, erotic aspects of the scenario. These guys were more concerned about the practical details and the difficulties, such as where can we obtain the hypnol? The van that they acquire should have a sliding door on the side so they can get their victim in more quickly. The danger of keeping the girl for too long before killing her came into the fantasies, because that was, would be a way they might be caught eventually. So I decided that it was very clear that these guys were planning action. This was not mere fantasy. And when they were faced with this testimony, the two guys confessed, changed their plea to guilty, and are now serving deservedly long sentences. And hopefully that might have saved a few little girls from being abducted, raped, and murdered. Another case I was involved in concerned a Brighton man who was on trial for strangling a young woman to death. And his defense was that she died accidentally in the course of mutually consenting breath play, he called it. Now, in his favour, he had confided an interest in bondage and asphyxia to 3 previous partners, and non-lethal activities of that kind had occurred with each of them. But nevertheless, I was not fully persuaded of his defence, because the particular victim that he'd strangled he hardly knew, and he also had a well-documented hatred of women. One of his ex-girlfriends reported that on one occasion he said he feared he might strangle and kill a woman, and that was shortly before punching her gratuitously in the face. Doctors' case notes taken 12 years prior to this event referred to violent thoughts toward women in general, including thoughts of murdering them. And it certainly didn't help his case that he concealed the corpse after he'd killed her in the big yellow storage down at Brighton. And he would pay it visits from time to time, take it out of the box to enjoy looking at it, got this on video, and put it away again for another few days. Eventually, of course, the stench became dreadful and he had to get rid of it. He took it up into the hills above Brighton and burned it. But it may not surprise you that the jury was not impressed by his defence, because the way in which he enjoyed looking at the corpse suggested necrophile interests as well. And he was found guilty of murder and is also serving a long jail sentence. But finally, there is a case that goes the other way. This was a young fellow, actually that's his picture here, his name's Colin Stagg. It's a very famous case. He was charged with a frenzied knife attack on a young mother in front of her child on Wimbledon Common back in 1993. The woman was stabbed to death in a frenzied knife attack. And this chap, Colin Stagg, they picked up, and he was being prosecuted on the claim that his sexual fantasies were so similar to the details of the crime, and his fit to a theoretical profile of the killer was so perfect that the chances of anyone else being responsible were vanishingly small, to quote the prosecution. Well, I was able to testify that the reported fantasies were actually quite common in the male population at large, so they couldn't even be declared particularly deviant. And anyway, they had been shaped by a female police officer who was put on his tail with the brief of attracting his interest and effectively offering sex to him if he could only come up with the right fantasy, which of course was one corresponding to the details of the Wimbledon Common murder. Well, I wrote a report to the effect that this argument and this evidence was totally unsatisfactory. Colin Stagg was a virgin at the time, and this police officer was effectively saying she'd have sex with him if he'd get the fantasy right. He never did confess to the fantasy, but he came up with another non-existent murder somewhere else entirely that he claimed to have been responsible for in the hope that that would satisfy her. So, despite all this, they were prosecuting him. I reckoned that the evidence was totally unsatisfactory. The judge agreed, and the case was thrown out of court before it even opened, but not before Colin Stagg had done a year in jail. And the tabloid papers continued to persecute him, giving the impression that he was somehow freed on an obscure technicality, and that everybody knew he was the killer anyway. Some of my acquaintances were giving me a hard time as well because I'd helped to free this terrible killer, and that he was going to get somebody else. Fortunately, they found the right guy. They came up with some DNA evidence that, in fact, the guy who had perpetrated the Wimbledon Common murder was already in jail for a series of remarkably similar stabbings around the south of London. So this chap was definitely innocent. Thank you very much, and I'll take questions if you would like.
For more information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.